Eruption 14.3 The Annexation of Arizona and Nevada, Part 3. The remnant United States was stunned by the Battle of the Strip. News footage of the assassination of the mayor of Las Vegas by attack helicopter was being broadcast on every morning news channel. Both the associates of the Italian mob and the city police officers began to flee into the side streets and neighborhoods when the heavy weapons arrived, with civil defense hot on their heels. Horrified residents hid in closets as machine gun fire and armor-piercing rockets ripped through their front yards. This fierce house-to-house fighting lasted until around noon. At this point, most of the Las Vegas Police Department had been killed, along with hundreds of civilians, both known gang members and innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. The American president was finally compelled to act. Direct confrontation with the Californians was still off the table. The scars of the Carrier War in the Pacific were still fresh, and they couldn't risk another military humiliation. Plus, the memories of the atrocities committed by the National Guard in the refugee camps after the eruption had been burned into the national psyche, and there was far too much political opposition to sending them in. An emergency session of the United Nations Security Council was called. The president himself delivered an impassioned plea for the outside world to send in peacekeepers to stem the violence and restore order in the territories. The Soviets and the Chinese gloated in the opportunity to be the ones to save the United States, and proudly announced they supported the resolution. It passed 15-0. In spite of the Eastern Bloc's apparent joy at America's misfortune, everyone in the room knew that sending Soviet or Chinese troops to North America was absolutely off the table. They were perfectly content with letting the West dig themselves out of their own quagmire and force the United States deeper into irrelevance. On top of that, the Chinese in particular were also in the process of rebuilding their relationship with the Pacific Partnership Treaty nations, and they didn't want to risk a confrontation with the Californians. Instead, the peacekeeping force would be led jointly by Canada and Mexico. Obviously, proximity to the conflict zone was the primary factor in choosing them to lead the operation. Both nations were also close to one of the belligerents. Canada was a member of NATO and still relatively close to the U.S., and Mexico was still cooperating with California on law enforcement. To everyone's surprise, California also welcomed the peacekeepers. Unbeknownst to the rest of the world, California had already accomplished their objectives. Most Californians still generally viewed the operation as brutal, but necessary to keep themselves safe. Those who were strongly pro-independence were actually elated to see Americans getting beaten up by civil defense, while the less nationalistic majority were just happy the LCL was no longer prowling the desert. They had also seen the footage of the Battle of the Strip. However, Californian media had been able to spin the story as the mob starting the fight, which was technically not untrue. The UN resolution was spun as the rest of the world assisting California in bringing order to the territories, and was also generally seen as a positive thing by most Californians. Given California's influence over international media and the internet, that was also the version of events most of the world was told to. Back on the ground in Phoenix, Vegas, and Tucson, civil defense set a strict curfew of 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. No civilians were allowed outside of their homes unless they were being escorted by an officer. Those who tested this curfew were immediately arrested, if not shot on sight. Even after 7 a.m., the only place citizens were allowed was food distribution stations, now being administered by civil defense. There was still some sporadic violence, especially in Las Vegas. However, by this point, most of the resistance had been put down. Downtown Vegas was pure bedlam. Bodies and destroyed vehicles were strewn across the streets. The Stardust had burned to the ground completely. Most of the other casinos on the Strip had been riddled with bullets and cannon rounds and had not fared much better. The air was thick with black smoke from the burning casinos and vehicles, as well as the fine, gray volcanic dust kicked up during the fighting. To many who had survived the eruption, the scene was eerily similar. The first peacekeepers to arrive were military police from the Mexican army around noon on September 4th. They were pleasantly surprised that the situation had calmed down in Tucson and Phoenix, although the city streets were empty. They were warmly greeted by civil defense and immediately deputized to begin the distribution of food and supplies they had brought with them from Mexico. On September 5th, most of the daytime restrictions had been lifted, and the citizens in these two cities could breathe a sigh of relief. The 5th also marked the arrival of Canadian and Mexican troops into Las Vegas. They were met with a city still very much under siege. None of the restrictions had been lifted, and gunfights were still breaking out in the suburbs. The first priority was to re-establish food and water distribution, a task that civil defense left in the hands of the peacekeepers. By keeping them occupied with humanitarian tasks, civil defense was still free to roam the city streets. The situation would calm down over the next few days, as by this point, any opposition to civil defense had been crushed. The restrictions were lifted. This would be the status quo for the rest of 1994 and beginning of 1995. February marked 6 months of peacekeeping operations, and the situation had drastically improved. Rebuilding supplies were free to flow into Arizona and Nevada now that there was effectively no longer a border between California and the territories. Refrigeration units had been ordered from East Asia and subsequently shipped to the territories, where they were installed in grocery stores and cold storage warehouses. Water and power infrastructure were fully restored for the first time since the eruption. California had installed the vice president as the acting governor of Nevada and the secretary of the Interior as the acting governor of Arizona. With the old, corrupt governments out of the way, these new interim governors set to work appointing deputies and establishing actual territorial governments. The three most senior generals of the civil defense forces had stepped in to fill the role of mayors of the three largest cities, and there was even talk of bringing back the old police departments. In spite of the death, damage, and trauma the Californians had caused, no one could deny their success. It was during February 1995 that the President of California was able to make the first official trip to the United States in order to address the UN General Assembly. The United States still did not officially recognize him as the head of state of a foreign country, and there were no official meetings between the two parties. They merely referred to the president and his staff as foreign dignitaries and offered them basic diplomatic protections. Still, the fact that the U.S. allowed them to visit unmolested was still a remarkable step towards official recognition, although the lack of an official meeting with the U.S. was still seen as a snub. The Californian president delivered a rousing speech to the General Assembly, in which he made the case for not only ending the peacekeeping operations, but also pointing out that California had done what the U.S. has failed to do for nearly a decade: rebuilding Arizona and Nevada. Californians had died to protect the citizens of the territories. California had invested millions of dollars into making the territories habitable again. Clearly, they were willing to be the stewards of this land and fill the void that the U.S. had left. They would grant the residents of the territories full citizenship and care for them as well as any other Californian. All they asked for in return was UN observer status for the three nations of the West Coast. The speech was met with a thunderous ovation, except for the U.S. delegation, who remained seated. The Security Council held a vote that evening to begin the drawdown of peacekeeping operations. The numbers were gradually reduced until the General Assembly vote on May 17th regarding the West Coast's observer status. The resolution passed by a wide margin. In addition to the expected support from the Pacific Rim and Latin America, the West Coast also received almost unanimous support from the former Warsaw Pact and Yugoslavian countries of Eastern Europe. Evidently, they felt a kindred spirit with their struggle for independence after the fall of a superpower. The feeling was mutual, and this act of support wouldn't be forgotten by the West Coast. The only no votes came from the US, UK, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Most of the other NATO countries abstained, save for Canada, who voted in favor in order to end the peacekeeping operation and bring their troops home. California, Cascadia, and Hawaii were now officially UN observers, including California's claims in Nevada and Arizona and Hawaiian overseas territories. The U.S. Congress rejected the resolution and still refused any formal recognition of the new nations. However, there was some quiet acknowledgement that this offered them a convenient way to rid themselves of some of the troublesome border territories. There was still no strong desire from the U.S. to enforce their claims at this time. California immediately moved to cement their custody of the new territories. On July 4, 1995, the counties with a permanent population were formally integrated into the Republic, gaining full representation just like old California. Technically, any distinction between the old state borders no longer existed, and Arizona and Nevada ceased to exist. Most people began referring to the area within California's pre-annexation borders as Old California, or Real California, while the new land was still referred to by either the old state names or just called the territories. Some of the counties of the far northern and eastern parts of Nevada that still had no permanent residents were lumped together into what became known as Wilderness County, which did not have any representation in the Californian Congress. Northern Arizona was divided into 5 areas: Grand Canyon National Park, Coconino/Prescott National Park, plus the Hopi, Wapai, and Navajo nations. The 3 indigenous nations were granted semi-autonomous status after a series of negotiations mediated by the indigenous nations of Cascadia. The end result was an arrangement very similar to the nations of Cascadia. They were allowed self-governance and representatives in the Californian Congress in exchange for contributing to national defense and cooperation with neighboring counties. Tangentially related, this led to a push for greater native enfranchisement in the rest of California as well. However, no further progress would have been made as of 2017. California also made resettlement and economic development a top priority. There was plenty of real estate in downtown Las Vegas after the destruction of the Battle of the Strip, which Californian resort and hotel companies bought up and began rebuilding in short order. Phoenix and Tucson also boasted plenty of open desert land for manufacturing and warehousing, not to mention vast mineral reserves. To provide a workforce for these new projects, the Department of the Interior launched the Desert Resettlement Program. This program was intended to address the issues of limited housing availability in the cities and the depopulation of Arizona and Nevada as a result of the eruption. Families who were renting housing in urban areas of Old California could enter the program, which would allow them to bid on the dilapidated, abandoned lots in the Phoenix, Tucson, and Vegas areas. These lots would be sold for just a few $1,000s, sometimes even less, and the DOI would offer a low-interest loan to build a new, habitable home on the property. The scheme was a way to provide those who traditionally didn't have the opportunity to own a home to purchase a property and hopefully build generational wealth, and it also prevented the land from being bought up by land-hungry developers. Some critics were quick to point out that the vast majority of those enrolled in the program were ethnic minorities, leading to the dubious nickname of the Brown Out-of-Town program in some circles. Yet, for many, it was finally an opportunity to break free of the slumlords and live in a nice, new home with economic opportunities nearby. The program proved especially popular with single mothers, so much so that it actually caused a noticeable split in the ratio of adult men and women in the Vegas area. Many young men also took the opportunity to relocate and get a job in the construction trades. Someone would have to build all these new homes, after all. The program was by no means perfect, but it was a long overdue step towards equity and real progress. The UN resolution also prompted a massive scaling back of the civil defense forces. As many as 25% of the total force had been released back to the National Guard by the end of 1995. By the end of the decade, nearly all the officers recruited from the CNG had either been sent back or been honorably discharged at the end of their contracts. In the aftermath of the annexation, civil defense tried to clean up their image, starting with recruiting and training standards. Prospective officers had to have several years' experience working as a regular police officer before they were considered. Having a degree in criminal justice was made a requirement. Their heavy weapons and APCs were returned to the National Guard, yet they retained their SWAT team-styled tactical gear. As the city police departments were reestablished, civil defense began focusing more on policing the deserts again, along with increasingly going after domestic terrorists and extremist groups. The LCL and the other gangs of the desert also did not disappear overnight. Smuggling into the U.S. shifted more to the use of boats and aircraft to bring the drugs directly to the U.S. Drug trafficking into California was still done by street gangs and small-time dealers. Biker gangs found a new racket in escorting truck convoys across the desert as the highways across the Eruption zone were reopened. They used this legitimate security service as a front for other illicit dealings, such as firearm and human trafficking. Both civil defense and the outlaws have remained a constant aspect of life in Arizona and Nevada until the present, in 2017, and both show no signs of going anywhere. While the Californian military was not directly involved in the annexation, they were able to learn quite a bit about combat and operations in the Eruption zone through the soldiers who had been transferred to civil defense. New cleaning procedures were developed for weapons, along with special lubricants designed to keep them from getting fouled by the volcanic ash. Special centrifugal air filters that had been developed for vehicles and aircraft were refined, also allowing them to operate reliably in the wasteland. Most intriguing was the recapture and subsequent reopening of the U.S. military's secretive testing sites in the Nevada desert. Recall that Area 51, Nellis Air Base, and Tonopah Test Range had been briefly captured by the Californian Special Forces during Operation Paperclip, 2. They abandoned these sites after the sensitive prototypes and technicians working there had been safely relocated back to California. The U.S. did not have the means to reopen them, and they had remained vacant until the Californians returned. The 3 facilities would be occupied and officially reopened by the CNG sometime in late 1995. Area 51 was officially renamed Groom Lake Air Base and National Laboratory. However, it was still commonly known as the Ranch. These facilities would be essential for the development of the West Coast's advanced defense projects in the years to come. Nearby Creech Air Base would also be reopened. This facility's mission being primarily to be the public face of the advanced projects, while the actual top-secret development took place some miles away. Some less secretive military bases were brought back online as well. Fallon Naval Air Station, Yuma Proving Ground, and Davis-Monthan Air Base were all reopened with much fanfare. They would be crucial to California's national defense going forward. Until next time.